You've been told the Silk Road started with China, that it was China's great gift to the ancient world, a network of trade routes radiating outward from a civilization that had mastered silk, porcelain, and statecraft, while most of the world was still figuring out agriculture. And for a long time, that story held up because nobody was asking the right questions about what was sitting underneath it, literally underneath it, buried in one of the most hostile deserts on the planet, preserved by cold and dry air for thousands of years, waiting for someone to look closely enough and ask, who were these people? And why do they look nothing like anyone expected? What if a completely different people were already living in Central Asia thousands of years before the Silk Road existed, thousands of years before the Chinese Empire even had a name? A people so genetically distinct and so culturally sophisticated that their very existence forces a rewrite of the standard story. And what if the science that proved it spent years sitting quietly on a shelf while much bigger forces decided what the world should and shouldn't know about the origins of one of history's most strategically critical places? By the end of this, the map you have in your head, the one with the clean lines and the familiar labels, gets completely redrawn. Let's go find out who they actually were. Start with the place, because the place is everything here, and most people have no real picture of what the Tarim Basin actually is, so let us fix that right now. Imagine a depression in the earth roughly the size of Germany, ringed on three sides by the highest mountain ranges on the planet. The Himalayas to the south, the Tian Shan to the north, the Pamirs to the west, and in the middle of all of that, one of the driest and most punishing deserts in the world, the Taklamakan, a name that in the local Uyghur language translates roughly to, you go in, you don't come out. That's the geography. That's the personality engine. And here's the part that changes how you read everything that follows. The rivers that flow down from those surrounding mountains don't reach the sea. They flow inward and die at the desert's edge, which means at the margins of that desert, fed by glacial meltwater, there are ribbons of green oasis corridors where the soil is wet enough to grow food and shelter a population. Now think about where those oases sit relative to the mountain passes. The passes in the Tian Shan and the Pamirs are the only viable land routes connecting the civilizations of the Far East with those of the Middle East, South Asia, and ultimately Europe. You want to move goods or armies between those worlds? You have to come through here. The Tarim Basin isn't a remote, irrelevant desert. It's a continental choke point, locked inside walls of stone and ice. And whoever lives at the oases controls the toll booth between civilizations. The desert that connected the world, that's what this place actually is. And once you understand that, the story of the people who lived here stops being a footnote and starts being a central chapter of Eurasian history. But here's where the conventional story starts to crack. Because the conventional assumption has always been that the earliest significant inhabitants of this region were Chinese settlers pushing westward, or nomadic Central Asian groups filtering in from the steppes. And that picture seemed reasonable enough until archaeologists started pulling bodies out of the desert, and none of them matched. The mummies of the Tarim Basin have been known in the archaeological literature since the early 20th century, but serious scientific attention built slowly, partly because of where they were, and partly because of what they looked like. And what they looked like was not what anyone expected to find in the western provinces of modern China. Red hair, light-colored hair, tall frames, features that looked more consistent with populations from far to the west than with any group you'd expect in that part of the world. The most famous of them, a woman found in a burial site near Lulan, was so striking in her preservation and her appearance that researchers nicknamed her the Beauty of Lulan. and she became something of a symbol for a question that kept getting bigger the more archaeologists dug. Who were the original Tarim people? Where did they come from? And why did their existence feel like something that needed explaining away rather than explaining? Keep that tension in mind because it matters later. The oldest of these mummies predate the Silk Road by over 1,000 years, some of them by more, and they show no obvious connection to the populations that would later dominate the region on either side. Their textiles are particularly striking because textiles are one of the most culturally specific technologies a society produces. And the fabrics found in the oldest Tarim burials are woven in patterns and using techniques that have striking parallels with Bronze Age cultures located thousands of miles to the west. Plaid and twill weaving, specific color combinations, specific loom structures. These don't travel by accident. They travel with people who know how to make them, which means the people in those graves didn't randomly develop these textiles in isolation. They brought the knowledge with them from somewhere, and that somewhere was not China, and it was not the nearby Central Asian steppe. So where did they actually come from? That question hung in the air for decades, generating competing theories that ranged from Western steppe migrations to South Asian origins, to a dozen variations in between. And for a long time, the argument stayed within the bounds of archaeology and linguistics, which meant it stayed productively inconclusive. But then the genetics arrived, and the genetics were not inconclusive at all. This is where it gets uncomfortable, and not just academically uncomfortable. A major ancient DNA study, published in 2022, drawing on genetic material extracted from the oldest Tarim mummies, produced results that overturned essentially every existing migration theory at once. The Tarim Basin people were not descended from Western steppe herders, as some researchers had proposed. They were not a branch of a South Asian population filtering north. They were not a mixed group assembled from neighboring populations through trade and intermarriage. The DNA showed something far stranger and far more significant. The earliest Tarim people appear to derive their ancestry primarily from a population geneticists call ancient North Eurasians, a ghost lineage, a group that existed thousands of years ago and contributed ancestry to populations across a huge sweep of Eurasia, but whose direct descendants are not obviously identifiable in the modern world. The DNA doesn't match the myth, and the myth in this case was every theory anyone had proposed. Because what the genetics actually showed was that the Tarim Basin people were genetically isolated to a remarkable degree. They were not significantly mixing with their neighbors to the east or to the west, which means they weren't a trade route byproduct. They weren't a frontier zone where populations blended. They were something rarer. A group that arrived somewhere, stayed, and remained essentially themselves for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. That kind of genetic isolation in a place that sits at the center of continental trade routes is almost paradoxical. And the paradox is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how this society actually worked. Now watch what happens when you layer that genetic picture onto the historical timeline, because the conventional assumption about the Tarim people has always cast them as passive, as a group that existed at the margins of larger civilizations and got absorbed or displaced when those civilizations eventually extended their reach, and the genetic evidence actively undermines that framing. A population that maintains genetic isolation for millennia in a crossroads location is not a passive population. It's a population that has successfully managed its own boundaries. And the archaeological record supports this, because the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin weren't outposts. They were sophisticated centers, with their own distinct material culture, their own burial practices, their own social organization. And for a very long stretch of history, they were, functionally, mandatory stops on every major overland route connecting east and west. Multiple empires across multiple centuries had to reckon with the Tarim oasis communities, not because they were pushovers, but but because the geography made them impossible to ignore and difficult to simply overrun. Every empire that wanted to move goods, armies, or ideas across the Eurasian landmass had to either negotiate with the people living in those oases or fight for control of them. And that dynamic gave the Tarim communities a kind of structural leverage that their population size alone would never have earned them. And here's what nobody tells you about that leverage. It wasn't incidental to their survival. It was central to it. Because a group that can sustain genetic isolation in a location that cosmopolitan requires active management of who comes in, who trades, who stays, who leaves. And that kind of management implies social sophistication that the passive frontier people narrative completely fails to capture. What happened to them? That's the question that starts pressing in around this point, and it's the one that connects the ancient story to the modern discomfort. And we'll get there. But first, the textile evidence deserves a second look because there's more in it than you might expect. The plaid wool found in the oldest Tarim burials isn't just culturally interesting. It's one of several threads, literally and figuratively, that researchers have pulled on when trying to map the Tarim people's connections to the broader Bronze Age world. And the threads don't obviously terminate in any single place, which is part of what makes the question of their origins so persistently fascinating. Some researchers have pointed to linguistic patterns in the region's later history as potentially relevant, because the Tarim Basin is where Tocharian, one of the most puzzling branches of the Indo-European language family, was eventually attested in written records. Tocharian is puzzling because of where it was found, deep inside Central Asia, far from other Indo-European languages, and because of its specific internal features, which suggest it branched off from the Indo-European trunk very early and traveled a very long way. Whether the earliest Tarim mummies are connected to the Tocharian-speaking populations of later centuries is debated. Some researchers see a line of continuity. Others are more cautious. But the question itself is significant, because it places the Tarim Basin at the edge of one of historical linguistics' biggest unsolved problems. Where exactly did the Indo-European languages originate, and how did they spread so far, so fast? Keep that open for now, because the genetics circle back to it. The duality at the heart of this story is genuinely strange, and it's worth naming directly. The Tarim people were, simultaneously, among the most genetically isolated populations in the ancient world, and physically located at the most cosmopolitan intersection point on the Eurasian landmass. They touched everything and belonged to nothing. Their location meant that the goods, ideas, technologies, and peoples of half the ancient world moved through their backyard. And their genetics say they watched all of that pass through without being fundamentally transformed by it, which is either a story of remarkable cultural coherence and deliberate self-preservation, or a story about how geography can create separation, even in the middle of connection. Probably both. And you don't have to resolve that tension to feel its weight. The point is that neither the isolated backwater framing nor the cosmopolitan melting pot framing fits, and the refusal to fit neatly into either category is itself the most interesting thing about them. Now let's go deeper into what the genetics actually show, because this is the part that rewrites the origin story at its foundations, and it needs to be handled like detective evidence rather than a biology lecture. So here's how to read it. When researchers extracted ancient DNA from the oldest Tarim mummies and analyzed it, the first thing they were looking for was connections, shared ancestry with known ancient populations, patterns that would let them say, these people came from over there. And what they found instead was an absence of those connections that was itself the finding. The Tarim people didn't share the genetic signature of the Western steppe herders who were spreading across Europe and Central Asia during the Bronze Age, which had been one of the leading theories before the 2022 study. They didn't show strong signatures of admixture from ancient East Asian populations, which would have supported a migration from the Chinese heartland. What they showed was a deep and relatively uncontaminated connection to an ancient North Eurasian ancestry base, a lineage that genetic researchers have been able to reconstruct from ancient remains found across a wide geographic range, but that doesn't have a clean modern equivalent. Think of it like finding a fingerprint that matches a file in the database, but the file is labeled source population, presumed extinct as a distinct group. The Tarim people were, in a meaningful sense, living descendants of a ghost lineage, carrying forward genetic heritage from a population that had been absorbed or replaced almost everywhere else, but had survived in the isolation of those desert oases. And here's the detail that makes this more than just an interesting academic finding. Both the maternal lineages, tracked through mitochondrial DNA, and the paternal lineages, tracked through the Y chromosome, tell the same story of isolation, which matters because in populations that experience migration or conquest, you often see asymmetry. Men's lineages replaced by incoming conquerors, while women's lineages show more continuity with earlier populations, or vice versa. The Tarim people show no such asymmetry in the oldest samples, which suggests this wasn't a story of conquest and replacement. It was a story of a population that arrived, established itself, and maintained itself, which means they weren't a migrant camp that happened to persist. They built something that functioned as a homeland. The 2022 study was explicit in its overturning of prior frameworks, and the implications radiate outward in multiple directions, including toward the question of Indo-European language dispersal. Because if the Tarim people's ancestry connects to ancient North Eurasian populations that were present in Central Asia before the major Bronze Age migrations that carried Indo-European languages westward and southward, then the Tarim Basin starts to look less like a recipient of those processes and more like a place that was involved in them from a very early stage. Possibly even a place where some of the relevant populations originated or passed through before the historical record begins. That's a careful framing. Researchers are cautious about this, and the full picture isn't settled, but the pattern is there. And an origin story that sits this close to one of history's biggest unsolved puzzles is not an origin story that has a clean ending. Now, here's why the science itself became part of the story. The Tarim mummies were discovered and excavated across the 20th century primarily by Chinese archaeologists working within the Xinjiang region, which is politically sensitive territory, for reasons that have nothing to do with Bronze Age genetics, but everything to do with contemporary politics and the question of who has historical claims to that land. The Uyghur people, a Turkic-speaking Muslim population, have lived in the Tarim Basin and surrounding areas for well over 1,000 years and represent the region's largest indigenous group. And some Uyghur commentators and activists pointed to the Tarim mummies as potential evidence of deep, non-Chinese roots for the region's population, a framing that the Chinese government found, to put it diplomatically, inconvenient. The scientific literature moved carefully around this political minefield for years, with the most thorough genetic analyses delayed and restricted in ways that several researchers noted explicitly. And when the 2022 study finally landed with its unambiguous findings about the Tarim people's distinct genetic identity, it did so in a scientific context that was already loaded with political meaning. The question of why certain findings stayed quiet so long isn't one with a single clean answer. Science moves slowly. Access to samples is complicated. International collaboration on sensitive archaeological material in politically charged regions involves layers of negotiation that have nothing to do with the science. But the pattern of delay and the specificity of what was delayed are hard to read as purely coincidental. Whether you read that as active suppression or as the natural friction of doing difficult science in a difficult political environment, the effect was the same. The full picture took longer to reach the public than the evidence warranted. What happened to the Tarim people themselves is a question the archaeology can partially answer, and the genetics confirms. The later Tarim Basin population shows increasing genetic diversity, consistent with the region's incorporation into successive empires. First Han Chinese expansion, later Turkic migrations that fundamentally reshaped the regional demographic picture, and the distinct genetic signature of the original Bronze Age Tarim people gradually gets diluted and ultimately disappears from the detectable record. They weren't erased in a single event. The process was slower and more complicated than that. But the endpoint is the same. The people who built those oasis cities, who wore the plaid wool, who carried the ancient North Eurasian ghost lineage, did not persist as a genetically distinct population into the modern world. Their genes almost certainly live on in some proportion in the populations that eventually replace them. The math of population genetics makes complete disappearance essentially impossible, but as a coherent, identifiable genetic community, they were absorbed into a larger story, which is maybe the most human thing about them. Every people that gets big enough to leave an archaeological record eventually encounters a force big enough to transform them, and the Tarim people, for all their remarkable persistence, were not an exception. You came in thinking this was a footnote in Chinese history, a curiosity in a distant desert, a few unusually preserved bodies that prompted some interesting speculation about Bronze Age trade and migration. Here's what it actually is. The Tarim mummies are one of the most direct windows we have into a ghost population that helped shape the genetic and possibly linguistic landscape of the entire Eurasian world. A group that maintained their identity with extraordinary coherence across millennia, in the most strategically important desert on the planet, whose existence the official history of the region's most powerful modern state found politically inconvenient, and whose true origins weren't confirmed until a genetics study in 2022 finally put on paper what the bones had been trying to say for decades. The isolated people in the world-crossing desert, the suppressed science, the ancient DNA that rewrites the map. None of those pieces make sense in isolation, but together they point to something that's bigger than any single origin story. Every civilization that has ever felt certain about where it came from has an older story underneath it. And often that older story involves a people who don't fit the clean narrative, who complicate the ownership claims, who turn out to have been there first, or to have been something stranger and more interesting than the textbook allowed. The Tarim people are an extreme version of a universal pattern. Their isolation was extreme. Their location was extreme. The political pressure to minimize them was extreme, and the genetic findings that vindicated them were decisive. But the underlying dynamic, the one where a people's real origins get flattened into a convenient story until the evidence refuses to cooperate, that's not extreme at all. That's how origin stories always work, and the Tarim Basin just happens to be a place where we can see the mechanics more clearly than usual, because the desert preserved the evidence and the science eventually caught up. Drop a comment below. Which ancient mystery people do you think history has buried the hardest, whose real story is still waiting to be told? And if this one cracks something open for you, stay with us, because next time we are going to a completely different continent with a completely different people and the exact same pattern. An official story that's confident, widely taught, and missing its first chapter entirely.